The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Hi, I'm here to pick up my son Milo.
There's no Milo here.
Who picked up my son from school?
Streaming only on Peacock.
I'm gonna need the name of everyone that could have a connection.
You don't understand. It was just the 5 of us.
So this was all planned.
What are you gonna do? I will do whatever it takes to get my son back.
I honestly didn't see this coming. These nice people killing each other.
All Her Fault. A new series streaming November 6th only on Peacock.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies Debrief. David McCloskey is a modern-day John le Carré. After leaving his post as an analyst at the CIA, he became the author of 4 popular works of fiction. More recently, he joined forces with journalist Gordon Carrera to co-host the podcast The Rest is Classified. David sat down with True Spies producer Morgan Childs to discuss his latest novel, The Persian, the challenges of getting past the CIA's review board, and the cathartic pleasures of turning real-life espionage into best-selling books.
David, thank you for being here. Your new book, The Persian, is about the shadow war between Iran and Israel. I'm interested to know what it's like to write a novel like yours and then to see the news unfold the way that it did in June of this year.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I was somewhat relieved in June that the book had already gone to press so that I didn't have to make any changes, because I've actually had this happen before on my second novel, Moscow X. I was done with the first draft. It's like a Russia-focused spy novel. And I was done with the first draft when Putin invaded Ukraine. And so I still had time, unfortunately, to make changes. I had to go into the manuscript and really significantly change the story to reflect the geopolitical reality that everyone who read that book was then going to have to, be reading it in the context of Russia having invaded Ukraine. This one was, both the decision was made for me, and so it was a lot easier after the strikes because I couldn't do anything. But then practically, I'm trying to write books and I'm trying to write spy stories that are happening well below the waterline. And so it shouldn't really impact the narrative that much if, you have military strikes, because the same impulses still exist inside, Mossad and the Iranian intelligence services to sort of spy on the other, right? And to conduct sabotage and assassinations and, all that kind of stuff. So it was obviously fascinating to watch, but I was grateful that it didn't feel like it kneecapped my plot, that writing that kind of story and trying to stay ahead of the headlines. I didn't even know how I would do that. So when I'm writing, I'm always trying to make sure that even if something goes absolutely haywire geopolitically, the story it's not going to go rotten. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I can imagine this gets easier with each novel, but that your heart would be pounding, especially in your case when current events seem to mirror what's on the page. Was this book informed by your own time in the Middle East, or how did you land on this subject matter?
It was, and it is. And, the kind of shadow war between Israel and Iran is something that I didn't work on it directly at CIA, but I did work on Syria. And so I have some intimacy with kind of the structure and form of that competition between Israel and the Iranians, or, Israel and kind of the resistance axis. So I had some sense of the dynamics, but I kind of walked into this story a bit haphazardly, ass over backwards, I guess. I started with the idea that there would be a story and I would set it in the kind of conflict between Israel and Iran. Literally, that is where it started. It was that broad. And then I was playing around with different concepts for what that would actually look like. And the one I landed on, which is one of the centerpieces of The Persian, is the idea that I would basically flip the dynamic on its head. So you go back to 2007, the Israelis have been targeting for assassination Iranian scientists and nuclear engineers and things like that. And the Israelis obviously have an incredible capability to operate inside Iran. I mean, you look at what happened in June, and in particular, how they were able to kill in large numbers senior military officials and scientists as kind of the opening salvo of this most recent round. They have so effectively penetrated Iranian society, and in particular, it's like intelligence and security services, that they can do almost, what they want sort of at will. I flipped that in the book and I said, well, what would it look like if the Iranians had this capability or some version of this capability inside Israel? Like, what would that look like? And you don't have to go that far to get there. The Iranians have recruited Israelis. They, Shin Bet, the Israeli security service, internal security services, arrested dozens of Israelis over the past few years on allegations of working for the Iranian regime and spying for the Iranian regime. So it's not that hard to get there. So I just flipped it and said, what would it look like if senior Mossad officers started to be killed in a very targeted fashion in the same way that we've seen Iranian nuclear scientists killed? And from there, it was kind of like, okay, that what if was enough to get me going on the book.
I have to wonder, as somebody who's has a real fondness for espionage stories, why, if that was the case, you chose to put aside your career in the agency when you did.
Yeah, so I wish I had a sexier story for why I left the CIA. And I really have the lamest possible story, which is I was working Syria. I had been working on Syria the whole time I was at the CIA. And it was made clear to me that I was going to keep working on Syria if I stayed for at least the next few years. And I was like, I don't think I really want to do that. I was in DC at the time and wanted to get out of DC. And this is the really pedantic part of this is I had never worked at an actual business. I had only worked for the government. And so I thought, well, it'd be nice to actually see how a business functions. This was the thought I had. And this is how boring it is, right? And all of that stuff conspired. And I'm like, well, I'll just try I'll try something else. And, if I don't like it, I can come back. And I had really enjoyed my time at the CIA. I think maybe in part because that's the only place I had really worked. I didn't realize how cool it was. I mean, I did, but you don't really get the full contrast until you get out. And you're working at a consulting firm and you're helping a company that makes concrete pipe figure out how it can sell more concrete pipe. And you're like, well, it was more interesting to work at the Central Intelligence Agency. So I've kind of wandered back, into this world of espionage and just kind of what's going on in the world, geopolitics, et cetera. I've sort of wandered back into that part of the field with my fiction. I don't regret leaving because the books wouldn't exist without me having left. But I left for very mundane reasons, let's say. I wish I had some awesome story, about something that's better than what I just said. But I just, it was boring, stupid stuff.
Well, I think another good story is how you became a published author. I'd love to hear you talk about that. And am I right that you started during a leave of absence from your consulting work?
Yes. I took a sabbatical, you could say, from the consulting work, and I was off for what ended up being 7 months. And my hobby during those 7 months, it turned into my job, was just to write the book. And I had actually started writing 5 years before that, right when I left the CIA. I had started to kind of write character sketches, ideas for a story, chapters. It was all this very disconnected Frankenstein thing that I think at the time I thought was pretty cool. But actually, if you were to read it, Morgan, you would be like, my God, this guy got published. This thing's terrible. It's really bad. But in writing that, I was like, oh, I love writing. I love writing fiction. I love writing something creative. And so I was like, how do I get back to doing that? I was like, all right, I'm going to write and I'm just going to finish this book. And I don't know if it'll be any good or if I'll, sell it or whatever. It might just be a Word document that exists on my computer, but I'm going to finish it. I took that 100,000+ word thing that I wrote in 2014 and I basically threw it away. There were some bits and pieces of it that remained, but really nothing substantial. And so, I guess you could say I had a practice book before I ever wrote another one. So I wrote an entire book that sucked and then I threw it away. And then having people read your stuff who are going to tell you what sucks, and in particular, why, I've found a few people who are willing to do that and have the capabilities and the skills to kind of help me break down, like, I've written this thing and I think it's pretty good. And then they read it and they're like, oh, it's, the characterization here is weak, or like the voice of this character is weak, or this doesn't make any sense, or this is boring. You do that over and over and over again, and you just start to get better. I hope the writing has improved over the course of my 4 novels as a result of just kind of continuing to run that process over and over and over again.
And for you, I mean, the refrain that I hear again and again with, former spies who go on to become novelists is that the work can help them process what they experienced and also the challenge of the work. Has that been the case for you?
I think with the Syria book, that was the case with Damascus Station. It had a lot to do with watching Syria just collapse into a civil war and state failure and the misery that ensued. The misery that was felt at a very human level, among ordinary Syrians. That got hard for me to deal with toward the end of my time at the agency because it was so bloody. And you kind of looked at a conflict like that and thought, I understand why this is happening, and it's also just so senseless, and there's so many innocent people whose lives are being destroyed by this. And that's hard to watch over time. You're taught and expected to have some analytic kind of distance from all this stuff, to look at it coolly and coldly. And that becomes hard when you're talking about individual people who were sucked up into this thing. And so writing Damascus Station was cathartic for me in that way, because I felt like I didn't have to write a book, or I didn't have to write a story about what the Assad regime was going to do next or why the conflict was happening. I could just write stories about individual people who were experiencing it and how they experienced it. And that was very cathartic. I'm not walking around with some sense that like what the agency does is immoral, or that I'm not walking around with these massive battle scars from my time at CIA. So like, I don't feel like the writing has, in general, been a way to process all of that. I feel like it's a way for me to explore that world in a different way than I did when I was inside. But I feel like with the Syria book behind me, I'm tending to write about settings and events now where I'm hoping to bring them to life, but they're less personal to me.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And I've heard you equate the experience of being an analyst to being a journalist.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling like, is that even more so the case now that you're a writer and a podcaster or a thinker by profession?
Totally. Yeah, no, I really do think the comparison holds pretty well. I mean, you're telling a story, in both scenarios. The mechanics of the writing are different, obviously, but I think whether it's the podcast, whether it's the novels, or whether it's writing at the CIA, like you're sort of always pushed to think about what's going on from the standpoint of somebody else. You're thinking about, okay, well, I mean, why does Bashar al-Assad do this? Why is it this way? If you're writing a character in a novel, whether it's a good guy, bad guy, mixed bag, like you're constantly asking yourself as the writer, like, well, why? Why does this person do this thing? Why? And you're doing that so that you can kind of craft their voice effectively. So I think that impulse is the same in the type of writing that I've done, throughout my career. That curiosity is really important. And I think if you're an investigative journalist and you're trying to write a piece about corporate malfeasance somewhere, something totally unrelated to the espionage business, you're still trying to ask those same questions. I think a lot of the mindset is similar. I will note, though, that I don't think the culture of a newsroom and the culture of the CIA are very similar. So it's not like the CIA is a big press pool, but I think there is some real overlap in those roles. And a lot of the job, in particular, if you're comparing like an analyst to an investigative journalist or something, like it's similar. It's a very similar role.
Well, I ask about your work as an analyst. I'm thinking about tradecraft, and now that you're writing tradecraft, you're coming at this from a specific perspective. And so I'm curious, to what extent did your experience in the agency really inform you enough to write your novels? And when do you find yourself needing to do more research to sort of understand how a fictional operation might unfold?
It's a great question because I was an analyst, right? And I'm not trying to hide that fact from anybody, right? I wrote analysis for the president, other senior policymakers, CIA officials, right? Like I was not a case officer. And so honestly, I know a lot about how the place works. And I obviously have some general understanding of the business that I think would be hard to get if you hadn't worked there. But every book every single book dozens of times in the writing process. I mean, I'm in the middle of writing the 5th one right now, and I've just gotten off of a conversation with somebody about a particular scene where I'm asking them, okay, well, if this happened, like, how would you approach it? You know, like, what would you do in this situation? And listening to their answer to do a couple things. One is to just get the mechanics of, like, if there's particular pieces of tradecraft or if there's a particular way that you would deal with something bureaucratically, I want to know that. And then I can figure out how much of that I keep. And I also want to hear these former officers talk about it, just to kind of get a sense of, like, well, how do they describe things? What words do they use? Those little tidbits of, like, character and lingo, and they're really helpful for the crafting of the voice of characters and thinking about, well, okay, I've got one of my characters, Artemis Proctor, who's in the first 3 books. She's not in the most recent one. You know, is an old school, kind of deranged CIA case officer. And I might not be talking to someone who's exactly like Proctor, but I'm talking to someone who kind of grew up in the same environment and has had a lot of the same experiences. And so, you know, if this or that contact of mine is going to describe something in this way, I'm like, oh, well, maybe Proctor would describe it in a similar way, you know, and add her own color to it. So I'm constantly running those kind of scenarios by formers, because you don't need to have done the thing yourself to write about it effectively. I think oftentimes that is helpful, but you do need friends who have done the thing to write about it effectively, right? And so if you have friends who are willing to help and talk to you, it's immensely valuable. And I try to take as much advantage of that as I possibly can.
Sean Bean and Connie Nielsen star in Robin Hood. From Sherwood Forest to the Norman Court, a classic tale reborn for today. The story continues to unfold. New episodes Sundays on MGM+.
Welcome to Sephora. I'm looking for a perfume that's not too perfumey. I got you.
Serum moisturizer or moisturizer serum.
Let's get into layering.
My concealer is making me look worse.
Sounds like the wrong shade. Let's get you matched.
There's only one store that really gets what you're going for. Get beauty from people who get beauty. Only at Sephora.
Hi, Let's get you a basket.
When it comes to factual information, does the CIA need to see where you got that information? I think most of our listeners are aware that the agency reviews manuscripts before they're published, but do they need to see, this is the source of that claim or that sort of description?
They don't necessarily need to see the source. There's certainly not a requirement that you do this, but with all of my books, I actually think with the exception of the most recent one, I didn't do this. I have sourced them. So if I think there's something that's, like, kind of on the line or close enough to it, and that could be, it's a tidbit about Vladimir Putin or Bashar al-Assad, you know, or it's a piece of tradecraft, or it's the mention of a particular piece of the CIA's organization, right? If I can find something that shows that that's already out there publicly, or better yet, has been put into a novel or a piece of nonfiction that the CIA's pub review board has already looked at, you know, it helps your case. So the first 3 books I did that, and I sourced it, and, you know, Damascus Station in particular, because I'd worked on Syria, I think I had 300 footnotes in there to show where I'd gotten stuff. That number of footnotes has gone down considerably over each book, because now it's like, well, I didn't work on Iran at the CIA, and so, like, my insight into this is very obviously not coming from my time at the CIA. So I don't source them as much. And the Israel-Iran book, the most recent one, the Persian, there are no CIA officers in it at all. There's no Americans in it. And so that one I felt more comfortable just, like, not sourcing it. But yeah, it's, you know, I'm still a little bit paranoid. So I like to source things when I can.
That's very generous of you. I feel like you've made a lot of people's lives easier.
I'm trying to be helpful, Morgan. You know, I'm trying to take the burden off of our friends at the pub review board. The last thing I want is to get into a situation where they say, hey, you can't use this. And I've actually got good reason to be able to use it, because, I mean, this is into the nitty gritty of how the pub review board works, but, like, I don't want to get into an appeals process with them, because that's longer and you're very likely to lose. I'd rather on the first blush have whoever's reviewing it say, oh, maybe that's on the line, footnote 45, go down there and be like, okay, it's in this book, it's already in the public domain, good, done. It's just cleaner that way.
Do they need to see it before even an editor sees it? At what stage of the writing process does the agency need to review things?
They are supposed to see it before anybody else. You can imagine why sometimes that could be challenging, but that's the rule.
So you have some fans in very high places, among them David Petraeus, who called your new book the best spy novel he's ever read. Not faint praise at all. Do you find that former spies are a natural audience for this kind of work? Like, is reading spy fiction also a form of processing things?
Obviously, everyone's different, but I'll give you my hot take on the answer to that question, which is no. Most formers, I think, do not gravitate towards spy fiction because the vast majority of it is just nowhere near close to the way the job actually is. And so they read it and they're like, well, what? This would never happen. And I just think most formers I know stay way clear of spy fiction. They don't watch spy shows on TV, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's true, actually, with many of them with respect to my books, too, who would probably just be like, look, this is going to be, even if it's a little bit better than the other stuff, it's just not going to be anywhere close to the real thing and they don't want to read it, right? That said, there is a significant community of formers. I'm sure there are formers who hate my stuff. I just haven't heard from many of them. Maybe they're being too polite. But there's a significant community of formers who like my stuff just because it is attempting to deal realistically. And I think this is the critical thing, is like, I am really trying, and I'm sure I'm not always getting this right, but my main characters tend to be CIA case officers. And so I am trying to get that character right. I am trying to show case officers as actual people, not superhero spies. I am trying to do the work to get the ins and outs of that job right as much as I can. And to hopefully, even though there's going to be things that happen in the books that don't happen in real life, even though I'm telescoping the timeline, because I'm not going to draw out a book over the course of 2 or 3 years if you're running a case, like I'm telescoping the timeline. There are things that happen in the books that are not likely to happen in real life. But that said, like, I'm really trying, if you get the voice of the character right, and so a case officer could look at that and say, oh, I see something of my cohort, myself, like in this character, in this, he's done a good job of getting, the person right. I'm really trying to do that. And I think that many of them have responded positively to that, because there just aren't that many books where the writer is rendering an actual CIA case officer as the character. They might call them a case officer, but they're something else. And I'm trying to make all my CIA characters like actual case officers.
Yeah, they may call them an agent. They may call them
right. Yeah, exactly. God help us. I don't understand it. Like I don't understand how that mistake is still made. There's so much material out there. Like there's just no excuse in this author's humble opinion. You should get that you should get that right. Even if the actual person you're rendering is not doing any case officer stuff and they're running around with a gun and killing people, you could at least call them a case officer. No excuse.
It does sort of feel entry level. I agree.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your podcast. You're one of the hosts of this very popular series, The Rest is Classified. I'm curious if hosting this show with Gordon Carrera, now multiple times a week, how this plays into your writing work and how these two jobs of yours fit together.
It has been a new challenge this year to reorganize my time to be able to do both of them. It's a lot of work to put the episodes together. Like the format, for folks who haven't tuned into it, the format is like Gordon and I are talking back and forth about an actual spy story. It could be Edward Snowden, or it could be Osama bin Laden versus the CIA, or it could be the hunt for Pablo Escobar. And to do that, and to have a conversation that's intelligent and informative and also entertaining, we've got to do a lot of research. And we do all the research ourselves. There's no team behind this doing the research. Like Gordon and I do the research. The other thing we do is we trade who's the lead. So like in some episodes or series, I'm kind of driving the narrative and Gordon is reacting or kind of helping guide it. But, he's kind of in the B spot, I'm in the A spot, and we flip and reverse that, every other series, essentially. We did one on bin Laden that I wrote. And, I wrote like 50, 60 pages of stuff put together from doing a bunch of research. That's a lot of work. So I'm trying to write the book and put the scripts together at the same time. So it's been a balance. What I will say is that I'm spending a lot of time reading about spy stories these days. And so as a result, I end up with a lot of ideas that I feed into the books. In particular, like as I've been writing book 5, every time I'm doing research for the podcast, I'm coming up with, I'm either meeting interesting new characters from sort of the world of espionage and espionage history, or I'm getting introduced to some little facet of like spy history that can actually be applicable into the books. Like as one example of that, I was writing a scene 2 days ago where a former CIA officer reaches out to a journalist because he wants to leak some documents and he wants to do it anonymously. And I just went back to my notes on the Snowden thing and was like, oh, well, here's how this would go, right? Because here's how Snowden did it. So like I've already got a template started for how you would leak things and do that in kind of a systematic way. And I could kind of get some inspiration from that past research for like writing some of the scenes in which this journalist is approached anonymously by this former CIA officer. So there's definitely like the pod and the books are complementary, but it's also a lot of work. That would be the short answer. I enjoy both of them immensely though. So the pod has been a lot of fun.
It sounds like you're your own intern to a certain degree.
Exactly. I do not have any interns at all. I could probably use some interns. Unpaid, of course. Unpaid. But yes, I'm very much the intern all the way up to the principal. At David McCloskey Books, it's just me. It's a one-man show.
Well, so I know you're doing a publicity tour for book 4, but now you've teased book 5 that I'm really curious to know. Like, can you tell us anything about it? What's coming next for you? The
concept for this book was, what would it look like to break the special relationship between the US and the UK to the point where both services were spying on the other, like actually spying. And I started with that as like the idea. That core bit of it has mostly remained intact. As I was like, can I find a way that's plausible in today's world for SIS to spy on the CIA and vice versa? And I think I did. So that's the concept, is like us versus the Brits is the setting.
Well, I hope you don't manifest that one like you manifested this.
I know. I had the same thought as I was writing it, as I was like, oh boy, like, let's not. Hopefully this one remains in the realm of like plausible, but not actually coming to pass fiction. Because it was interesting, Morgan, like having conversations with a bunch of formers at CIA and also on the British side. It wasn't that hard. It just wasn't that hard. You wish it would be harder, and it wasn't. So makes my job easier as a spy novelist, but as a global citizen, I'm concerned.
Well, thank you. It sounds juicy nonetheless, and I'm really excited for that and grateful to you for being here. Thanks a lot.
No, thanks for having me. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you, as always, for tuning in to The Debrief. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between David McCloskey and True Spies producer Morgan Childs. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer: the views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
I gave the Abbé a packet of money and wished him Godspeed. He was to return the following Tuesday. On Saturday, a courier I had sent to Marseille came back with the news that 3 WOL agents had been arrested on the 15th and 16th of August.
3 members of the Abbe's circuit had been arrested a week before he had met Virginia in Lyon. He hadn't breathed a word about it.
I was uneasy in my mind about the Abbe.
On the 2nd of September, the Abbe returned. Smelling a rat, Virginia asked him to describe the WOL agent who collected his packages. Nervously, he described her as tall and blonde. He couldn't have been further off. Virginia knew that she was a short brunette. What would you do? Demand to see his papers? Or perhaps you'd seek a more permanent salve to your suspicions.
True Spies, the Classics, from SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.